Have you ever heard the expression, like, throwing gasoline on a bonfire?
Oh, absolutely.
It's like that, right? That's what the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine felt like to a lot of people, myself included. But to really understand this whole firestorm, we have to rewind the clock a bit. Today we're diving deep into the history of the Russo Ukrainian War, way beyond the headlines.
Yeah, it's not just about tanks and treaties. It's about understanding a relationship fraught with tension, centuries of shared history and culture, but also conflict and mistrust.
Okay, so let's rewind. What's the historical backdrop here? What are some of the key moments that kind of led to this powder keg situation?
Well, imagine two siblings who grew up together, shared toys, shared holidays, but also constantly competed for attention and resources. That's Russia and Ukraine in a nutshell. They share roots in Slavic civilization, but their relationship has always been one of both interdependence and rivalry.
Okay, that's a helpful analogy. So when does the modern chapter of this rivalry really kick off?
The big turning point is the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Suddenly, Ukraine, which had been a part of the Soviet Union, declares independence. This was huge. It totally reshaped the geopolitical map of Europe.
And Russia wasn't exactly thrilled about this, right?
Not exactly. You see, from Russia's perspective, Ukraine has always held a very special place, not just because of their shared history, but also because of Ukraine's strategic importance. Access to the Black Sea, fertile land, and a buffer zone between Russia and the West.
Makes sense. So how did this newfound independence change the dynamics between them?
Well, at first, there was hope for a peaceful and cooperative relationship. In fact, Ukraine made a pretty big concession early on. They agreed to give up their nuclear arsenal.
Wait, hold on. Ukraine had nukes.
They did.
Oh,
After the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Can you imagine that?
that's wild. Why would they give them up?
Security. It was all part of a deal brokered in 1994 called the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine agreed to completely denuclearize in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK. Basically, these countries promised to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
This is like a pretty good deal at the time, so how'd that work out?
Well, as you can probably guess, not so great. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014 was a major turning point and a blatant violation of the Budapest Memorandum.
That's putting it mildly. It was a total breach of trust, and it sent shockwaves through the international community. But why Crimea? What made it such a flashpoint?
Crimea is a peninsula in southeastern Ukraine with a complex history and a majority Russian population. It's also home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which gave Russia a strategic foothold in the region.
So in Putin's eyes, was taking Crimea more about reclaiming what he believed was historically Russian territory, or more about geopolitics and projecting power?
It's probably a bit of both. Putin has often spoken about the historical and cultural ties between Russia and Ukraine, framing them as one people. This narrative has been a key part of his justification for the annexation and, later, the full-scale invasion.
So how did we get from the annexation of Crimea to all-out war?
Well, the annexation was a major escalation, but it didn't happen in a vacuum. Remember those pro-Russian protests in eastern Ukraine we mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
Those tensions were already simmering, fueled in part by Russian propaganda that painted the Ukrainian government as illegitimate and hostile to Russian speakers.
Right. This whole Nazi-controlled Ukraine narrative that Russia pushes,
Yeah.
it seems completely unfounded, especially given Ukraine's own history with Nazi occupation during World War II.
Exactly. It's a deeply cynical and misleading narrative, but one that has resonated with a segment of the Russian population and provided a pretext for intervention.
So while the world was still reeling from the annexation of Crimea, another conflict was brewing in eastern Ukraine.
You got it. In April 2014, just weeks after the Crimea annexation, pro-Russian separatists, backed by Russian troops and weapons, seized government buildings in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. And this is where the situation escalated from a regional dispute into a full-blown armed conflict.
This is what's so fascinating and terrifying about this whole situation. You have these deep historical grievances, territorial disputes, and geopolitical maneuvering all colliding at once. It's like trying to untangle a giant knot, and every time you pull on one thread, it just tightens the knot even more.
It's a perfect storm, and unfortunately it was only a matter of time before things boiled over.
It really was a perfect storm, wasn't it? And in 2022, all hell broke loose.
Yeah, you could say that. Throughout 2021, those satellite images started showing something really alarming. A massive, and I mean massive, buildup of Russian troops and military equipment near Ukraine's borders. We're talking tanks, artillery, the whole shebang.
So even with all the denials coming from Moscow, it must felt like the whole world was holding its breath.
Oh, absolutely. There is this sense of impending doom, even though many people, myself included, were clinging to a sliver of hope that diplomacy might somehow prevail. Western intelligence agencies were sharing some pretty alarming reports. Reports that suggested that Putin's plans went far beyond just securing the Donbas region.
He was going for the whole thing,
Yeah.
taking over the entire country.
That was the fear.
Yeah.
And those fears were realized on February 24th, 2022. That's when Putin announced the beginning of a special military operation in Ukraine.
Right.
But let's be honest, that special military operation phrase, that was Putin's way of saying invasion without actually saying invasion.
Yeah, it's all about controlling the narrative right from the start.
Exactly. And this wasn't just about the Donbas region anymore. Russian forces launched a full-on, multi-pronged assault. They were targeting key cities across Ukraine, including Kiev, the capital.
I remember watching the news and seeing those images of Russian tanks just rolling across the border,
Yep.
missiles raining down on Ukrainian cities. It was surreal,
Yeah.
like something out of a history book, not the 21st century. What was the immediate global response like?
It was a mix of shock and outrage. Governments, organizations, people from all walks of life, they condemned the invasion in the strongest possible terms. The UN General Assembly, they voted overwhelmingly to demand Russia's withdrawal. Western nations slapped Russia with these unprecedented sanctions. Sanctions targeting their economy, their banks, even prominent oligarchs close to Putin.
It was a huge show of global unity, at least on the surface. But did those sanctions actually deter Putin?
Unfortunately, not really. While the sanctions definitely hurt the Russian economy, they didn't really change Putin's calculus when it came to Ukraine. The fighting raged on, particularly in cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol. Those cities endured some of the most brutal fighting in those early months of the war.
And Mariupol, God, that siege was just heartbreaking. The world watched in horror as that city was just pounded into rubble. But even amidst all the devastation, something remarkable happened, didn't it? Something I don't think anyone could have predicted.
You're talking about the Ukrainian resistance.
Exactly. They were completely outgunned, outmatched, but they refused to back down.
They were incredible. The Ukrainian people, with the support of volunteers and foreign fighters, put up this fierce defense, a defense that surprised everyone, including, it seemed, Putin himself. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence as a nation.
And at the heart of it all, with Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, he went from, comedian, political outsider to a wartime leader practically overnight.
Zelensky's leadership during this crisis has been remarkable. He stayed in Kyiv when pretty much everyone expected him to flee. He rallied his people, and he became this, symbol of Ukrainian defiance on the world stage. His nightly addresses, often delivered from the streets of Kyiv, galvanized international support and, turned him into this unlikely hero.
It was a masterclass in leadership and communication. He didn't shy away from the cameras or the tough questions, He showed the world the human cost of this war, and he challenged other nations to stand with Ukraine.
And they did. The outpouring of support for Ukraine has been truly unprecedented. We saw governments sending weapons and humanitarian aid, individuals opening their homes to refugees. There was this incredible wave of online activism.
Speaking of online activism, you can't talk about the information war without mentioning NAFO, right? I mean, who would thought that Shiba Inu memes could be a weapon against propaganda?
Right. It sounds crazy. But NAFO, or the North Atlantic Fellow Organization, they're this decentralized online group. They use humor, memes, and online sleuthing to counter Russian disinformation and boost morale. And they've been incredibly effective at getting their message out there. They've even raised funds for Ukraine. It just goes to show you the power of online communities in the face of conflict.
It's like a 21st century David and Goliath story, with memes and social media as slingshots.
Totally. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always room for hope, resilience, and a little bit of humor. But while the Ukrainian people in NAFO were winning hearts and minds online, on the ground, the war was far from over.
So we've got bravery on the ground, memes battling it out online. But wars aren't won on morale alone, right? What about the real-world ramifications of this conflict? This isn't just some regional issue, is it?
Absolutely not. Not at all. The Russo Ukrainian War has sent shockwaves across the globe, that's for sure. One of the most immediate and significant impacts has been on the global energy market.
Right, because Russia's like a major energy supplier, especially for Europe. They rely heavily on that Russian natural gas, don't they?
Exactly. And when the West imposed those sanctions on Russia,
Yeah.
one of the key pressure points was their energy sector. And while that led to a pretty big surge in energy prices globally, Europe really had to scramble to find other sources, alternative sources of natural gas.
And then, just to add fuel to the fire, so to speak, we had that Nord Stream pipeline sabotage back in 2022. Man, that was a whole other level of geopolitical chess, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Nord Stream pipelines, those were like this vital energy artery, between Russia and Germany running right under the Baltic Sea.
Right.
When those pipelines were damaged by those underwater explosions, it sent shockwaves, you can believe that, through the energy market. And it definitely escalated those tensions between Russia and the West even further.
I remember thinking, who would do something like that? It felt like something straight out of a spy thriller or something.
Yeah.
Like, for real.
Well, the investigation into the Nord Stream sabotage, it's still ongoing. It's become a real geopolitical hot potato. Some Western officials have hinted at Russian involvement, suggesting it might have been like a false flag operation,
Oh.
designed to further destabilize that energy market and maybe sow some discord among the Western allies.
Right.
But of course, Russia denies this.
Of course.
And, they're pointing the finger right back at the West. It's the truth, as they say, is often murky in these sorts of situations.
For sure. For sure. But, well, the world's trying to untangle that whole mystery. The war grinds on. And it's the Ukrainian people who are paying the highest price for it. Millions displaced from their homes. Entire cities are just rubble. The constant threat of violence, it's hard to even fathom.
It really is a humanitarian catastrophe. The UN estimates that millions of Ukrainians have been internally displaced and millions more have fled to neighboring countries, just trying to escape. The physical destruction is just staggering. Entire cities devastated by shelling and airstrikes, and every day the human cost just keeps climbing higher and higher.
So, given all this death and destruction, what are the potential scenarios here? How might this war actually end? Is a negotiated settlement even remotely possible at this point? I mean, really?
It's tough to say. I mean, there have been attempts at negotiation, but nothing concrete has come from it, There's been very little progress. The two sides seem to have such fundamentally different goals. Ukraine, they're fighting for their survival as an independent nation. They're demanding that Russia completely withdraws their forces and they get security guarantees for the future.
And Russia. What does Russia want out of all of this?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question. Putin, he's talked about the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. But I got to be honest with you, those seem like pretty flimsy pretexts for something a lot larger, for a much broader geopolitical agenda he has. It seems likely that he wants to establish a pro-Russian government in Kyiv, regain control over all of Ukraine's resources, and just prevent them from ever joining NATO. It's like, I don't know. In essence, I think he just wants to turn back the clock. He wants to reassert Russia's dominance in the region.
So as long as their goals are that different, that at odds,
yeah,
it's hard to see how there could ever be a peaceful resolution. What does all of this mean for the average person listening to us right now? Why should they care about a war that's happening, thousands of miles away?
That's a really important question. You're right, this war might seem really far away for a lot of people, but it truly does have implications for everyone. This war. It's a war that strikes at the very heart of the international order. It challenges the whole idea of national sovereignty and territorial integrity. If a country like Russia can just invade and annex its neighbor, just to take it without any consequences, that sets a very dangerous precedent for the future. Imagine what that means for global security if that becomes the norm, not the exception.
It's a chilling thought. It's like, it feels like we're at a crossroads in history, and the choices we make right now are going to have some far-reaching consequences.
I agree, 100%. And that's why it's so important for everyone listening to stay informed, to engage in thoughtful discussions about this, and to hold our leaders accountable. We have to make sure they're doing everything they can to find a peaceful resolution to this crisis. Because ultimately, this isn't just about Ukraine or Russia, it's about the kind of world we want to live in. Do we want to live in a world where might makes right? Or do we want a world where international law and diplomacy win out?
Those are powerful words to end on. This has been a truly eye-opening deep dive, and I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope our listeners out there will take some time to learn more about this incredibly complex and critical issue. We'll see you next time.